You know what makes me happy? That after this gruelingly long period of living off scraps, survival horror fans have really made it through the drought and been eating well these past few years, leaving no crumbs. We've been getting extremely well-made, big-budget revivals of the biggest hitter series like Resident Evil and Silent Hill over the past years, and the indie scene is just bursting with genuinely passionate survival horror titles that are both loving throwbacks to a bygone era, while often enough elevating the OG formula by taking all the right lessons from this genre's rich and troubled history. Now, there was a time, I'd say around 5-6 years back, when this resurgence started to peek its buds out of the soil, and a regular cartload of incredibly promising indie projects started surfacing and announced their presence with atmospheric and foreboding teasers, and the appetite of the survival horror fandom got regularly stoked for new juicy morsels to come. The problem was just that many of these projects were, when they were first announced, in a pretty early stage, made by small, often inexperienced teams, and it was still a long way to go to realizing these visions these passionate developers titillated us with. And as it so often happens, many of these projects also disappeared from the face of the earth at some point for various reasons, often unbeknownst to the public. But equally, we've been entering a time where those that did prevail and kept the long and hard work up are actually seeing the light of day. And one such gem is the subject of today's video, post-trauma. Post-trauma is an, in many ways, astounding looking love letter to specifically the Silent Hill branch of psychological survival horror. It was first revealed to the public via a demo on itch.io all the way back in the summer of 2021, and has since then been fervently continued development by a tiny team really, with an eventual publishing cooperation with Raw Fury in 2022. All the way back then, it already looked extremely promising. Beautifully moody and high-fidelity environments of a derelict subway station that immediately brings back memories of Heather's subway sojourn in Silent Hill 3, and a protagonist whose design struck upon first sight as a welcome diversion from your usual canopy of horror game heroes and heroines. 4 years have passed, and Post-Trauma's long and arduous development odyssey is finally at an end, as it releases, well, literally today, the very moment this video is released. Well, okay, technically that's a bit disingenuous on my part, because the moment I'm writing these words, the game is still a good month from being released. As it so happens, my contact at Raw Fury reached out to me in the months the game was gearing up for release and asked if I was interested in covering it on launch. Hell yeah! Now, full disclosure here, this video is a sponsored collaboration with Raw Fury, but it is not an ad. I firmly insist on having full editorial freedom for this type of review video and the unrestricted ability to praise and criticize the game wherever I see fit. And you'll see that I'll have plenty of both. There's a lot to praise about Post-Trauma, but the game also certainly has its rough edges and flaws that I absolutely will not omit in my review. See, while playing this game, there were parts about it that felt like it delivers exactly what I expected from what is essentially an incredibly high production value Silent Hill fan game produced over half a decade. But there were also definitely moments where I realized that this game put its structural and gameplay focus in quite different areas than I expected at all. And I kept thinking a lot about what felt like the most important question in giving an honest launch review to Post-Trauma. Who is going to have a good time with this game? And this is not meant sarcastically. My goal with this video is to give you an, as much as it's possible, spoiler-free overview of Post-Trauma, highlight its strengths, talk about some of its weaker areas, and try my utmost to give you a thorough impression of, really what kind of game this actually is. So when you go out of this video, you will have a good idea if Post-Trauma might totally be your shit, or if you had quite different expectations of it than it actually wants to deliver on in the first place. Make sense? Alright, then let's start our foray at the very beginning in a situation that we probably all are intimately familiar with. Waking up on the floor of a derelict subway wagon with absolutely no clue how we got here. Seriously, hate when that happens.
Where is this? Where am I? Hello?
Post-Trauma puts us, for most of its playtime, into the shoes of Roman, a mid-50s, early 60s Japanese subway train conductor who finds himself on the floor of a dilapidated and nightmarishly distorted subway train, as I said, with absolutely zero clue how he got here in the first place, and especially why he's here. The environments ooze an eerie, foreboding ambience that the place feels like a waking dream. Things look familiar to him but strangely out of place at the same time. Texts on ads and print magazines look like a scrambled version of his memory of them, jumbled and distorted, making no sense at all upon closer inspection, and everything feels like an ephemeral hallucination. Before we explore and delve deeper into the nightmare realm, I want to point out how much I love the design of Post-Trauma's protagonist. Roman is such a striking choice of lead character for a horror game. Really, from the first moment the game was presented, that also immediately created this hard association for Post-Trauma with me whenever it was mentioned. It's that game with that protagonist. Because, for starters, can we appreciate how cool it is to have the main character of a horror game be visibly a bit heavier set? Roman looks very much like a believable person, with his charming dad belly and constant look of consternation on his face. And really, I was so happy to find that the actor who voices Roman in this game, Togo Igawa, was a pitch-perfect choice. His accented English feels genuinely authentic, which is wonderfully accentuated by moments of confusion or distress where he slips into Japanese expletives, combined with his overall very believable and emotional performance. Big fan. And it fits, because Roman has a lot of reason for confusion. After finding a way out of the train cart by solving one of the game's many puzzles, more on that later, we explore the subway station, which is in a similar state of disarray. Vending machines flickering in electronic agony, walls caved in, and the hallways and walkways distorting in strange ways. Roman is oblivious about his immediate past, and so he is in the very same shoes as the player, wondering what the hell is even going on. Which is really the central mystery of the game's story, and it drip feeds us little snippets scattered across the length of the game, bit by bit, and entirely disjointed and convoluted, which confuses Roman just as much as the player. I really want to point out again how beautifully the environments are realized. The locations we traverse throughout the game, almost without exception, are spine-chillingly atmospheric and look, at the best of times, absolutely dashing, modeled and textured with great care and chock full of detail into the last corner, which works wonderfully in tandem with some fantastic camera work and a tasteful use of the Unreal Engine 5's lavish post-processing effects. Not in excess, but in a way that underlines the atmosphere the game wants to get across in its otherworldly scenario in its very own unique way. Several times the fixed camera switched to a shot that just really made me feel seriously uneasy, even if effectively nothing happened. I'm always a big sucker for slow burn, and Post-Trauma is definitely that. It's a game that takes its time and does everything but overload players with a tiring and endless barrage of combat encounter over combat encounter. Some might even say to a fault, but that's what we're here to explore. For me, this game was an interesting excursion in genre expectations, because on one hand, it is absolutely a classic survival horror game a la carte that, especially in the first hour, cooks the dish by recipe to the T, almost to a degree where it takes the surprise factor a little bit out for a seasoned survival horror veteran. The progression through the subway station, at least the first iteration of it, feels almost like coming home for someone who's replayed the classic Silent Hills over and over again, which is a weird feeling considering that the place we're in is not exactly a very welcoming locale. We make our way through derelict and disheveled hallways and gangways, along platforms and escalators, through barely functioning turnstiles and barricaded gates, and it all feels very much like a high-definition remake of Heather Mason strolling along Hazel Street Station. Yeah, Post-Trauma is a game, and I highly respect it for that wears its heart on its sleeve and does not in the slightest try to obfuscate its primary sources of inspiration. A subway map in the very beginning is already ripe with references like station names that nod their head towards Henry Townsend and James Sunderland, among others, and throughout the game you'll encounter a regular avalanche of little details and things that are clearly meant to reference the classics this game so fervently worships. From character names that pay homage to everyone's favorite Special Forces MILF, UI sound effects that feel almost lifted directly from Silent Hill's user interface, as well as the choices in locations and their overall design and structure, as well as several instances where the game gives obvious nods to the Silent Hills playable teaser PT, including an audio sample that sounds so eerily similar to Lisa's croaking breathing in PT that I had to rewatch some old recordings of PT to double check if it isn't actually the same. But speaking of PT, interestingly, when Kojima's playable teaser was making the rounds and people were eagerly theorizing and speculating about it, there was one theory going around that the initials, which were officially meant to say playable teaser, secretly stood for post-trauma, which was something I immediately thought of when this game here, Post-Trauma, was first revealed to the public back around 2021. Filling a game with references to other works is really a very neutral thing to me. Some people love it to bits and get an absolute kick out of it, while others find that it can obstruct the coherence of the world itself. This is ultimately for you to decide if you vibe with it or not. But yeah, back on topic. The opening segment felt so tailor-made classic survival horror that, while being a genuinely nice and warm throwback, also pulled a bit the punch for me in some parts, because after getting roadblocked by a barred metal gate, we circle back and find a crowbar to pry it open. And conveniently, we are now carrying our first melee weapon. I like the subtle narrative elegance of it, textbook good old point-and-click adventure design, where you create a situation that makes it logical for the character to pick a certain item up for one situation, which then puts that item in their inventory for later use in a different context. In this case, a weapon, because up until this point we encountered no enemies or anything that indicates to Roman that he will have to get into physical confrontations. But when the point comes where we encounter our first monster opponent, we are conveniently equipped with a means to defend ourselves, and it made sense for him to have it with him, Would have made much less sense if there was a pistol lying around and he just equipped it without knowing that he will have to fight sometime soon. I find this nice because it shows that a lot of thought went into structure and believability of the characters, and through that the players' actions that the biggest part of the audience wouldn't even think about twice if it's done right, but that can feel off if it's done carelessly. And it all makes sense and goes as it so often does in a slow build-up survival horror narrative. Roman, still completely in the dark, both literally and figuratively about what's going on, spots a person at the end of a hallway and, kind soul that he is, approaches them politely with a request for help and assistance in this strange situation he finds himself in, only to, well, in this case, I felt like I, as the player, was actually way ahead of the protagonist in terms of knowledge and information on the situation, because everyone who's played the odd survival horror game knows what this moment is. This is the Romero in the mirror slow zombie reveal, the lying figure in the boarded up tunnel moment, the reveal of the first antagonistic monstrous opponent to the completely unexpected protagonist. And since we don't have a Barry to run to take care of it for us, it's time for a bloody beating. But that's what we expect from a survival horror game, right? There will be blood, and blood we certainly get. The combat in Post-Trauma is quite serviceable for the most part, especially when it comes to melee encounters. We attack and dodge, trying to outflank our enemies and giving them a beating without taking hits ourselves. We have the option to lock an enemy, similar to how it works in games like Dark Souls, where our focus remains steadfast on our target, and our movement now acting relative to their position, making circling movements around them more easy. What I can absolutely praise is the developers going all out on responsiveness and effects. Blood particle effects gush across the screen lavishly, and everything it touches in the environment gets drenched in juicy dark blood decals, including the enemies and the player character. Yeah, Roman's nicely ironed button-up shirt looks regularly ripe for a deep cleaning after just one encounter, and the droplets cover his face and body quite gratuitously. It's pretty satisfying. Now, one thing I won't be doing in this video is discussing the story in detail, because I want to keep the discovery of plot development and twists to those who decide to get the game and play it for themselves. I will, however, go through some of the gameplay elements and environments that the game reveals to us over time. For instance, back on topic again, when it comes to the combat. You will eventually pick up firearms as well, but they, including combat in general, is absolutely not a central focus of the game, much less than I actually expected to find. There are two firearms that I discovered during my playthroughs, a small caliber handgun and a pump action shotgun, so pretty basic stuff. Now, I said before that the combat is for the most part serviceable, and that also implies that it definitely has its flaws, and was in some ways not quite what I expected, which doesn't have to be a bad thing per se. I'd like to discuss this in two different places, meaning I'm going to talk about one aspect that was different from my expectations now, here, and then I'm going to come back later to it after tackling a different point that I think is a great setup for what I want to talk about, okay? So the first thing that subverted my expectations was how little combat there actually is. Post-Trauma is a game that absolutely takes its time in building suspense and unease and consciously avoids overloading the players with an endless array of combat encounters. After this first run-in, I found myself exploring quite a bit more of the station, completely unopposed by any new monsters, and to my surprise, I realized that the game had me solve multiple puzzles, find a key or a key card to gain access to a previously restricted area, find fuses to restart an engine that then has to be set to a certain state in order to jumpstart and open the door to the next area, or combination puzzles. While traversing and exploring the dilapidated environs that get literally devoured by strange organic masses, I felt like I was solving puzzle after puzzle, always expecting more enemies to be right around the corner, but for a long time they didn't come. Now, during my first playthrough, I played the game on normal of the two difficulty modes. I later replayed it on hard mode, which states that there is more and harder combat, and yes, there were some more enemies, but it still felt surprisingly sparsely populated by enemies. And this really kept going on throughout multiple sections of the game. Over the course of the game, we also changed perspective several times, which was quite a welcome breakup of pace. For some parts of the game, we step into the shoes of Carlos, a police detective who is similarly stuck in his own purgatorial version of his old police precinct, similarly abandoned and disheveled, and his segments play from a first-person POV, which had several elements where it felt like the game wanted to give a bit of that PT feeling that we never got to see realized in the full Silent Hills game that we were promised back in 2014. In his segments, there is absolutely no combat at all, and only a small segment where we have to evade an enemy patrolling the precinct's flooded basement. Or later in the game, we temporarily step into the shoes of another character, a schoolgirl who illuminates her way with a flashlight of a smartphone, and for a small segment of the game, we re-explore areas we previously traversed as Roman, but in her shoes, we're faster, more agile, and have absolutely no means of defending ourselves. But we're also smaller and more nimble, so we can access passages that Roman's dad bod didn't fit through. It's genuinely a nice touch. And it reiterates my point about how surprisingly little combat there really is in this game, because the typical survival horror affordances are all in place. We have a small 5-slot inventory, a health bar that quickly depletes, and very limited ammunition and health restoratives, even on normal mode. From time to time, we find much beloved save rooms where you can save your progress at little cassette player radios, freely in normal difficulty and with unused cassette tapes for each save. The equivalent of Resident Evil's ink ribbon and typewriter system, essentially. And with a chest in which we can stash items that will be carried over to other save rooms in order to free up some much needed inventory space while exploring. Nothing sucks more than finding some ammunition or health restoratives and having no slot in your inventory to put them in. But despite that, I was genuinely confused by how little resistance I encountered. By the time I was easily halfway into the game, I felt like I had fought maybe 4 enemies in total? I didn't count, but however it was surprisingly little. Instead, the time is spent with exploration through lavishly designed eerie otherworldly environments, slow drip feed of story exposition where we remain for the most part as clueless as Roman himself, who feels genuinely penitent for something he apparently fucked up big time in his immediate past, but equally clueless of what's going on and for how long he's been stuck in this purgatorial realm. And puzzles. Puzzle after puzzle. Like I said, often of the find the right key or to do some combination based on hints scattered across the environments and logic puzzles. This was so much so that it had me quite confused for a while. I kept asking, who's this game actually for? And while this might sound sardonic, it's not meant like that at all. I initially approached this game expecting the same typical blend of survival, combat, horror, and puzzling as I'd encounter in all the other genre progenitors, in whose footsteps Post-Trauma follows rather closely for the most time. But instead, I realized at some point that this is a puzzle game. And this is by no means a bad thing, because the moment I had shifted my expectations, I was genuinely starting to have a great time. So let's talk about the puzzles, since this is evidently such a pivotal part of the experience Post-Trauma wants to deliver. I might sound facetious, but I assure you it's not meant like that when I say that while I was playing Post-Trauma in 1 to 2 hour intervals, taking my sweet time, I would chat with friends in between sessions, and eventually we'd place bets on how many combination puzzles I would encounter during my next session. I usually set the bets too low. It really is such a strong focus of the game. And yeah, most of the puzzles that you encounter throughout the game are in some form combination puzzles. You either have some keypad that requires a fixed digit key code, or you have a padlock with a number combination, or many different variations of that. One puzzle, for instance, has you utilize an alternative numerical symbol system and then apply it to clues you will find in the environment and thereby calculate the correct combination. I want to emphasize that the puzzles in this game are not what's generally referred to as stock puzzles in game design nomenclature. Stock puzzles are the inclusion of self-contained puzzles that pose a lateral thinking challenge to overcome, but that can be solved within itself. But the vast majority of puzzles in post-trauma utilize exploration to find clues in the environment, which then usually have to apply it with one or more think-around-the-corner logic steps and some head math. In many ways, the opening sequence where our protagonist wakes up in the subway wagons is a perfect example. A padlock at the rear door with a 5-digit number combination, and throughout the train wagons you'll find graffiti on the walls, floors, and ceilings that equate essentially PlayStation symbols, square, triangle, circle, X, to numbers. Then you have to find the master key, i.e. the combination of symbols that contain the actual door key, and then transpose it. This one is a rather simple example, which makes sense as it's really the first challenge in the entire game, but some of them really require some careful observation and lateral thinking to complete. And while there are a good bunch of puzzles that require some form of numerical sequence to be decrypted in one way or another, you can tell that the developers really do try to change it up over time. Like one puzzle where the correct key is hidden in various rhythms you can find across the derelict school building, which then has to be applied to a metronome in order to open a little compartment that gets you the key you need to progress. Or another one where you have to calculate the correct score of, yes, a basketball game with the help of an explanation on basketball scoring rules and a written protocol of a local game, including having to figure out which team is which by looking at other information provided than exclusively the scoring. Sometimes the clues are scattered across the environment rather blatantly, where there's just something written on the walls that clearly can only be a clue for a puzzle, and other times they are hidden more diegetically, in a way that makes it feel more like the information is part of the environment instead of just plastered there for the player. Like in the hospital ward, where the necessary information for a combination can be found in the directions signage. And especially with those where the information is just plainly scattered in the environment without much obfuscation, I found myself thinking, why would the information be so blatantly written here? This doesn't really make sense if you think about it. But then also realized, yeah, that's honestly not very different to your average Silent Hills at all, because it is, after all, an id machine we're finding ourselves in. A hallucinatory, purgatory-like simulacrum assembled from our protagonist's memories and trauma, amalgamated into a strange, chaotic scavenger hunt of internal punishment. So it totally makes sense in the context, since we're essentially just a rat in our own mind maze. And here's the thing. Initially, I was thrown off a bit when I encountered puzzle after puzzle, often without any combat encounters at all in between for long stretches of time, because it was just not the gameplay structure I expected from a survival horror game. This could easily be a segue for a whole-ass talk on the nature of genre and how its main purpose is pre-digesting a set of expectations in the audience. But then I got to the point where I realized I'm actually enjoying myself. Which makes sense as an old Myst veteran who can spend weeks in different ages inspecting every single screen, jotting down a plethora of notes, solving puzzles, and figuring out obscure machinery to gradually uncover the greater machinations of those strange places. And Post-Trauma is definitely a game for note-takers. Puzzle solutions rarely get pre-chewed for you in any way, so you have to constantly be observant and analytical in order to not have to backtrack without end. Personally, being an old point-and-click adventure grognard, I intuitively started jotting everything I observed that felt like it could be important at some point down without even being prompted, and it came in handy so many times. And after finishing the game, I have accumulated several pages of cryptic number and symbol salad that gives anyone having a passing glance at my desk the impression that I must be some Illuminati-obsessed cryptography maniac. I enjoy this type of game, especially when I buy a game specifically with the intention of wanting a little brain teaser. I can get totally sucked into this and have a wonderfully relaxing lateral thinking vacation. Here, with Post-Trauma, it took me just a little adjustment of my expectations of what this game is to get straight into this mindset. I think what I'm trying to say here is, if you are someone who really doesn't like logic puzzles, combination puzzles, and similar lateral thinking challenges, Post-Trauma will probably be a bit overburdening for your personal liking. Because yeah, you could just use a walkthrough and click through all the puzzles without attempting to solve them for yourself even once, but that would also make you skip a large part of the game, and honestly, one of the parts that makes it stand out against other survival horror titles in my opinion. Because while Post-Trauma's puzzles are not at a level of the Riven, which I admit is an impossibly high bar to begin with, meaning that most logical challenges are rather self-contained and it's not one massive interlocked system of many tinier cogs and gears, etc., it also doesn't want to be. The puzzles it does deliver were, to me, serviceable at worst, and clever, brain-teasing, and outright enjoyable for the most part, really. Which also made me think, am I going to replay Post-Trauma at some point in the future? Not playing a game twice is in my book by no means a negative judgment. Some games say what they want to say and then end, and that can be extremely satisfying. But I believe I might just go for a replay when enough time has passed that I forgot most of the solutions to the game's puzzles, and I find myself feeling like a sinister survival horror themed puzzle action adventure a good while down the line. Now, when I brushed on the combat earlier, I talked about the one unexpected side of it, and that is that it has such a low focus in this game. But I also said that I'd get back to this to talk about another aspect. As I already hinted at, while Post-Trauma is an at times beautifully modeled and designed labor of love that delivers on many areas, it certainly also has its flaws. One aspect that stood out to me most was, compared to the beautiful modeling and texturing of both environments and characters, the animations, especially character animations, cannot live up to these standards. I've used this expression a few times before in this video, but having played through the game twice while keeping a close eye on things, I can say that for the most part, the animations are serviceable at best, but there are certain parts where they really lack in expressiveness and feel sometimes even a bit disjointed. Roman's character is a great example. His model looks so striking and original, but his walk cycle, especially when he's holding a melee weapon like the crowbar, looks and feels incredibly robotic. I felt a bit mean thinking it, but it sometimes gave me the impression that he's got some constipation going on. I kept wondering where this originates from, and one of my theories is that it has something to do with the character's rig using a blend of inverse and forward kinematics, which you can see when Roman, for instance, passes an area where the ceiling is a bit lower, like here, and he automatically smoothly adjusts his torso to swoop under, which looks pretty great and smooth to be honest, but that the system sort of prevented the walk animations from taking more space in the upper body area? I'm not sure. Because looking at the animations of the other playable 3D person characters here, they look much more smooth and dynamic in comparison. And this is a constant throughout the game, not with every animation, but there are numerous occasions, for instance in sequences where hands clip through objects or characters' bones bend at an impossible angle, instances where it's decidedly not meant to be an element of uncanny valley or anything. But honestly, this is by no means a neckbreaker. It creates a bit of a janky feel to the gameplay, and people who followed me for a while know that I've been raving about games with infinitely more jank than Post-Trauma. The only part where it does hinder the enjoyment of moment-to-moment gameplay to me is, and here we're circling back to my earlier points, the combat. See, while the melee combat works and feels fine for the most part, save for some glitches I encountered during boss fights where the enemy just keeps being locked away from the player model, allowing me to just waltz them dead without any resistance, the firearm animations feel genuinely out of place to me, and I think I get what they're going for. Here, have a look at this. The handgun we get is, I believe, a Colt 1911, according to the game, a small caliber handgun. The real equivalent sports a 45 ACP bullet, which packs a bit of a punch, but not something that could toss a 250-pound person halfway across the room. It's pretty manageable, even for someone with little to no experience in handling firearms.
45 slugs, it'll even smoke pot.
Roman though, well, when he shoots it, he jerks his entire upper body, completely independent of any lower body movement, backwards, yanking his arms upwards in a weight 4 feet, only to just as quickly jerk back into his previous idle position. As I said, I'm pretty certain what they were going for here, underlining through design that Roman is in fact not experienced at all in handling firearms. But the way this is portrayed in the game just feels off. As I said, this man has a heft to him, and the forces emitted by a projectile's recoil simply don't operate like that. It's a common misconception that a firearm's recoil pulls the gun upward like this, but really what it does is it pushes the gun towards the wielder in a rapid blow, and the barrel's upward tilt followed by that is an instinctual adjustment motion that results from the way our bones and joints naturally bend and feather in this specific isosceles stance. The way Roman responds to the gun makes it feel like he's an 80-pound schoolgirl who's just been handed a Desert Eagle without instructions. This is similar to the way the shotgun animation looks, where Roman pulls the gun in a wide diagonal bow all the way up and around backwards. Again, the heavy grunt, a strong indicator that what they were going for here was that he's not really adept at this at all. And honestly, I respect that decision. It's a great way to increase the feeling of player disempowerment by putting us in the shoes of not yet another Special Forces super trained soldier type character, but in fact an everyman whose total count of gunfights in his lifetime likely amounts to nil. I'm definitely being a bit pedantic about this, because in the hectic situation of a confrontation, this isn't even quite as noticeable as here when presented in isolation. But I will go back to my initial point and say that really for the most part, they're completely serviceable. But it did genuinely make me wonder. Post-Trauma, especially for an extremely small indie title, looks at times astonishingly high in production value, almost scratching AAA visual fidelity in some of its best moments, especially when it comes to models, textures, and effects. I was thinking, if this game would have had the typical indie game pseudo PS1 retro hauntology look with low poly models, pixelated textures, and the signature potato faces, would I have noticed the animations like that? Or would it have just felt like it belonged into the crunchy lo-fi aesthetic and not thought twice about it? I kept thinking that Post-Trauma sets its own bar so high in some ways that something like the animations, which aren't terrible for the biggest part of the game at all, stick out so much more in comparison. That's food for thought, and I'll welcome you to discuss this in the comments section. Honestly, I genuinely enjoyed my time with Post-Trauma. Yes, it has its flaws, and I wanted to make sure not to hide them at all. In many ways because I think if the developers have the means to work on some of those kinks I pointed out, I could genuinely elevate it to become even more than it already is. What I got was a true love letter to psychological horror with a truly one-of-a-kind, in the best of ways, protagonist that I found genuinely charming and very easy to relate to, and a murderous row of beautifully designed environments that on one hand feel like a genuine throwback to the good old days. The subway station to Silent Hill 3, the hospital which gave me strong vibes of 2 and 3, and the school setting which screamed Silent Hill 1 Alyssa, but which on the other hand were not just carbon copies, but still managed to conjure their very own unique identity. So many set pieces and artful camera work underlined by a mesmerizing hauntological soundtrack that managed to create more than a good handful of moments of genuine chill. Plus, a heaping helping of, now that I've adjusted my expectations, genuinely enjoyable logic puzzles. I said before, when talking about the animations, that Post-Trauma set for itself an incredibly high bar. This is true in another sense as well, because by being essentially a distinct love letter to specifically the Silent Hill branch of psychological horror, the bar to meet could not be higher. As I said, I wasn't going to spoil anything regarding the story itself, but I'd like to talk a little bit about themes and their execution, because when it comes to Silent Hill, there's generally the understanding that there is the lineup of original Team Silent created games and everything that came after. And these developers who got passed the torch to carry on the Silent Hill lineage, starting with Origins and going through various attempts at rekindling the Silent Hill flame, were met with a similarly insurmountable challenge. The original Silent Hill games are often boiled down to, this is a sort of purgatory, people come here because they have sinned in some way or have some other baggage to process and aren't really fully aware of what exactly is going on, but their path ultimately can lead them to some form of redemption or condemnation. But this is in many ways a very simplified take on the goings-on in this otherworldly locale. Team Silent's games go so much further than the paint-by-numbers formula and continuously obfuscate and contrive the notion of this place, play wild and unexpected twists on it with a certain inimitable je ne sais quoi. The games that were made after Silent Hill 4 went about their task rather methodically and created this formula, mostly deriving of the setup of Silent Hill 2, pinned down the most iconic elements and attempted to write their own story based on this formula, at least initially. And I've always been a big defender of games like Origins, Shattered Memories, and Downpour, especially the more Sam Barlow was given freedom in narrative design and they started putting their own spin of things, which made them eventually feel like their very own thing. And that I highly respect. Post-Trauma felt very similar in that sense to me. The only difference is that here is a small, dedicated team of passionate indie devs whose lofty goal was to make their own Silent Hill, essentially. No blackjack or hookers though, as far as I can tell. So thematically, it goes a very similar way by establishing a purgatorial other world that orients itself on the most pivotal elements of Silent Hill games without really getting as weird and scrambled as Team Silence works, while still trying to walk its own path. This is ultimately not a good or bad thing, it's its own thing. And if Red Soul Games' interpretation of an odyssey of tormentous redemption clicks with you personally, I'll leave that for you to decide. One thing I was genuinely impressed by was learning about the game's launch price. I myself, as I mentioned, received access to an in-development version a bit over a month before the game's ultimate launch, so I wasn't aware of what it was going to cost, but when I was told that it sells for around only $18 on Steam, PlayStation 5, and Xbox Series S and X, I was genuinely gobsmacked because at that price point, you really get a lot of bang for your buck. And hey, with a playtime of a single playthrough of around 6 to 8 hours, something that many people would consider quote-unquote too short, I personally found myself rejoicing at a game that really doesn't overstay its welcome. That
says what it wants to say and then it ends. Didn't need anything more than that.
As a busy adult with a full schedule who groans at the constant trend of every game wanting to be a forever game that perpetually wants to rope you into playing hours every day with barely a moment of it feeling actually fulfilling, Post-Trauma's length was just about the perfect size for a juicy indie survival horror morsel. Seconds, please. Alright, thank you so much for watching, everyone. I sincerely hope that my excursion through Post-Trauma could help you make up your mind if you're gonna give this game a shot for yourself and support the hard work of Red Soul Games over the past half-decade on this. Seriously, support your local indie heroes. In case this was your first video of mine, hey, I'm Ragnar, and on this channel I cover old games, indie games, horror games, and combinations thereof. And if you enjoyed this little foray, then you'll probably find a ton of videos on games that might be right up your alley. Check it out and subscribe if you like. And there's another way to help me and everyone who works on this channel out. Our main source of sustenance has been for years the monthly donations of my Patreon supporters. It is the bread and butter, the financial backbone of this now over 10 years running endeavor of video game analysis, and any pledge within your personal comfort levels really helps out a great deal. As a little bonbon, on my Patreon I also regularly release backer-only bonus videos I wouldn't upload on my regular channel. More experimental stuff and thematically a bit different things, like video essays, sometimes let's plays, or like I recently released a dramatic reading of Lovecraft's Dagon, stuff like that. There's a whole library of videos that are available to new backers straight away. If you want to see what all the bonus videos are, here's a link, which you'll also find in the description of this video, to a little website I made where I catalog them all in one neat place. So check it out if you're curious. Thank you a lot for considering, and with that, I say ta-ta for now, and I hope to see you in the next video. And I'll leave, as always, with a heartfelt shout out to these lovely supporters. Aria, Billy Stein, Aurora Milpomene Crescendo, Vincent Kavanaugh, Amber Wiggins, LSN HNG, J.R. Smith, Sulmatul, Link Hughes, Swiss Hackmod, Tabby, Matt Gretton, Angelo Benedetti, Uziel 1447, Terraflops, Chuck Taylor, Kenan Ward, Alfred Correa, Nathan Gillick, Dana Rosa, Hunter Crawford and Margaret Strawn, Corey Marr, Kyle Lee, Gehennas, John Boring, Catherine Escobar, David Zelenak, Felix D., Laird Wakala, Righteous Itch, Thwagam, Shannon Blue, Morgan K., Ronan Crom aka Daniel 242172, Ari Orson, Zodi, Thomas Bona, Billy Lott, Jean, Lucas Ferreira Leite, Kerry George, 9ball 9606, Hendrik van Rensselaer, The Spiral Architect, Nikot the Brave, Casper Ram, Sable Cowl, Dr. Haley Isabella Colley, Vasily Prokhorov, Amber Wiggins, Chris E., and Giselle. Until next time, ta-ta.